Welcome to Security Weekly. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. We are recording live from DEF CON 27. We're at the Social Engineer Village, and joining me for this interview is Kirsch. Welcome.
Good morning. Hi, how are you doing?
Good. I'm great. Your talk was on cold reading.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to talk cold reading.
Yeah.
But let's start. What the heck is cold reading?
So cold reading is a technique where you're trying to make other people believe that you have psychic powers, right? So it's, I don't claim to have any real psychic powers, but these are techniques that have been, passed down the line, and there are books about this stuff on how you can make people believe that you can predict the future, read their mind, give them advice about their life, and so on. Yeah.
Got it. And now you did a really interesting experiment.
Yes. So I read a book about cold reading. I recommend if anybody wants to get into this, it's Ian Rowland's The Full Facts book of cold reading. It's still available. And he gives a very good overview, right? And I read it and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. But then I wanted to try it out. And it's kind of weird to go to you could go to your family members and friends and so on, but I already know them pretty well. So I didn't want that to taint my experiment, right?
Okay.
But I also didn't quite want to go up to random people on the street and say, hey, I'm a psychic. Can I do a reading for you? Because they'll think I'm completely nuts, right? So what I did is I work for Veracode, and they organize 3 days of hackathons twice a year.
Okay.
So hackathons are different things to different companies. For us, it's a little bit like think of it as a mini DEF CON, right? So there's like escape rooms and like this and that. And
you're bringing in customers and prospects, or?
No. This is, you can work on anything you want.
Okay.
There's only 2 rules. So you have to either learn something new or work with people you haven't worked with before.
Okay.
So the psychic readings was both. I was learning something new, and I was working with people that I hadn't met before.
Right.
And if you've seen my pickpocketing talk from Layer 8 that I gave, that also started at a hackathon. Meeting new people, learning new skills, right?
Okay.
So so I advertised that I would do psychic readings. I didn't disclose up front that it was a cold reading, that it was fake, right?
Okay.
Because that would have influenced the experiment. And a few of my colleagues were looking at me a little bit strange. But, that was the risk I had to take.
Right.
And so then I did, I think it was like 8 readings over the course of 2 days. It's not a crazy amount, but I actually found it to be extremely draining from like a mental exercise, because I had to hold up a conversation and kind of like read a lot of social cues and process these and think about how do I package those up so that they sound like a psychic reading.
Oh.
So there's actually a lot going on in the background, because I wanted to give kind of custom psychic readings rather than a stock one, which is also surprisingly effective. You can just write a generic one, rehearse it and learn it by heart, and then give it to everybody the same, and everybody will kind of find their own identity within it, right?
Got it.
But I wanted to go a step beyond that. So that was the part that was a little bit more taxing.
A little challenging, because you're sitting with a person you don't know.
Yeah.
You're having a conversation, you're processing, trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to make this reading work and make it believable, right? Because that's the trick here, is making it believable, where the person sitting on there sounds like, wow, how did he know that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's, cold reading is not just one technique, it's actually a whole collection of different techniques. And a lot of them are super interesting. And the reason why I wanted to learn about this is, number one, because it's a wacky thing to research, and it was really fun. Number 2, because I think there's a lot of crossover to social engineering and so on. And in my talk, I actually talked about a lot of applications, direct applications for.
Well, I was going to ask you the same question. How do you apply in a social engineering setting then?
Yeah. So let me go back to your earlier question, right? Like how did the reading work? So I started out and I asked people, have they had a reading before? I was trying to gauge the
kind of their experience.
Their experience and their level of skepticism,
Okay.
right? Because that's really important. So I asked people, so have you had a reading before? And some people might have said like, oh, I did one once and so on, and I'm not quite sure. So those are the maybes. Then there are some people that said like, oh, no, I'd never do that. I'm just doing this for fun. And then there were some people that were kind of like, had been going to psychics for 20 years. So I had the full spectrum, right? And that was really important to me because I needed to know kind of, number one, I wanted to make that part of the experiment, like their predisposition coming in, and then how they came out and how that changed their view. The skeptics were really hard to convert. The maybes were actually the easiest to work with. They could be convinced either way, so it was easier to sway them.
Yeah.
And the hardcore believers kind of fell into two camps. Some of them said like, "Hey, I don't believe you have psychic powers, and you need to," or like, "You need to train a little bit more," kind of thing, right? And that was fine, right? And I was doing this for the first time. I don't claim to be like a professional psychic.
They were telling you to hone your skills.
Exactly. And then there was one person who, even after I told her that I didn't have psychic powers and revealed the methods that I used, she still said like, "Oh, but I do believe you have psychic intuition," and she was really into it. I couldn't convince her of the opposite.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
It's very interesting, yeah.
So now how do you apply these techniques to social engineering then?
Great.
You know, where does that fit in? And because I think it's an interesting part to get somebody to believe something, right? And so how does this how do these skills kind of transfer over into that?
Yes, sure. So I gave you the example earlier of gauging the sitter, right?
Yeah.
And let's say you are doing a vishing call as part of a social engineering exercise, and you're trying to figure out the technical savviness of the person on the other line, right? Because you should know that before going in, because if they have no technical savviness, you can completely BS the whole conversation, and they'll believe anything.
Right.
If they have a very high technical skill set, you might have to adjust a little bit, right? The risk is higher. You have to tread a little bit more carefully. So you could ask as part of the IT support call to say like, "Hey, I'm going to walk you through this, and I'm going to help you through this, just so that I get a sense for your technical expertise. Are you more of like a regular Outlook user or Office user, or do you go into the advanced settings and drop down to the command line once in a while, right?"
Yeah.
So this is kind of like giving them two options and having them self-select and gauging their savviness to go in, right? And that gives you a good indication of how to shape the rest of the call.
Interesting. Yeah. So using that technique kind of guides you down the path of getting the information that you want at the end of the day, which is credentials or whatever, right? Exactly.
Then I had I printed out from Google image search some astrological chart. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it actually does. And I printed that out and said, "All right, we're going to get started in a moment. And what I would like you to do to start out with is I want you to close your eyes, take a pen, put it on the paper, and draw lines across the chart, right? And in any shape or form, and you're done when you're done, right?" And that was kind of like in the social engineering world, that was my pretext, right? I was setting up the why and how, and I told them about like how I'd learned this from my grandmother in Thuringia, like she's from Eastern Germany and so on. And so I also had them write down their date of birth, trace their hand on the other side, and write the initials of somebody of significance to them on the back. And then, so that was kind of my pretext. Most of that stuff didn't have any impact on my reading, but I was always referring back to it and looking at it and so on, right?
Trying to make them believe that it did.
The date of birth and the initials actually did play into some later rounds that we can talk about in a moment. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And then as a next step, so what we learned about that for social engineering purposes is, really sell it. Like even if your pretext is kind of like a little shaky and it just came up with it on a whim, right? Really
just go
sell
for it,
right? Just really go for it. And if you've seen the documentary on the Fire Festival, channel these guys.
Right.
Really bad idea, but boy did they sell it, right?
They sold it. Yeah. That's true. They did.
Yeah.
All the way to the end.
And then I would ask people, so if after they told me, like, have you had a reading before or not? And then let's say they haven't, right? I would say, so let me provide my perspective on, how this works and give you a little bit of an intro, right? So the things I see, I can't quite steer them. So, you can ask me for a certain direction, but it whatever comes.
Right.
And it also might not all make sense to me, but I need your help to interpret it.
Oh,
right?
I see, yeah.
So that means, number one, you are setting the precedent that, hey, you might be wrong, or it might be the right information, but we just didn't interpret it right.
Yeah.
So you're giving yourself
a little
outs.
Yeah, just in case.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, you're making them do the work, right? You throwing something out there, and they have to interpret it.
And you actually get them to refine it for you.
Exactly,
in some respects,
right?
Yeah.
So in an SE context, let's say you are going in completely cold. You've done no research on a target. You might walk into an office and say, "Hey, somebody asked me to fix the cables in one of the meeting rooms, and like fellow about this tall, nice guy, short brown hair, and then somebody else would say, oh, you probably mean Richard, right? So they provide you the information,
right?
They're doing the work, and they've just confirmed to themselves that Richard asked you to go and check out the conference room, right?
Yeah.
So you try and do the same thing and have them do the work.
Got
right?
it. Yeah. So you said date of birth mattered and the initials mattered. How did that come into your
So that
script?
came in at a later part. So I did one thing where I looked up the 3 most common first names, both male and female, for all the decades since like 1970s to the 2000s. And I had that on a little cheat sheet. So when they were writing down their date of birth, I looked at their year and then looked at my cheat sheet. And in I think it's like the 90s and 2000s, for example, 2 of the 3 most common female names are Jess and Jen, or Jessica and Jennifer, right?
Yeah.
So if it's a woman sitting there, I would pick female names, and if it's a man, usually male names.
Right.
And then I'd say something like, oh, I'm sensing that there is somebody of significance to you, somebody you haven't been in touch with for a long time. And they, you've thought about reaching out to them, and they want to connect back with you. So I'm getting the sense, I'm getting the letter J, like a Jess or a Jen or a Jessica or Jennifer. Does that, like, who is that person? Right?
Yeah.
And so you're fishing for that, and about half the time I got a hit on those. All right, so you're just playing with the probabilities.
Right.
And when they said, no, don't know any Jess, don't know any Jen, I don't know what you're talking about, then you can use an out, because a psychic is never wrong, right? You can use an out, and you can say, oh, I get a really strong sense that this person has a big influence on your life. And so if they haven't come along yet, then please make sure to look out for them.
Oh, I see.
So you're doing a time shift, right?
Yeah.
You're going from past to future, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't in the past, then it's somebody that's in the future.
Yeah.
Recommendations for anybody on how to use these skills, because I think you talked a little bit about recommendations in your talk as well.
Yes. So you can use it for SE, right? I have applied some of these things for salespeople, right? So sometimes instead of one thing that's very strong in cold reading is don't ask questions, but make statements.
Okay.
Right? You're coming across a lot more like you actually know the subject matter. And so if I'm saying, and I'm using a random example here. Oh, your AWS bills, I hear your AWS bills are very high, right? Either they'll contradict you if it's wrong, right? And say, oh, no, I don't think that, right? Or they say, oh, yeah, and they think like you already know their company and you know their problems and so on, right?
Yeah. Builds that confidence with the customer and gives your salespeople a little more confidence in building a rapport, a relationship with the customer. Very interesting. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll come back soon.